My name is Daniela Herrera from the School of Advanced Defense Studies in Rome. I am the chair of the CPR, and in my capacity as chair of the CPR, I am delighted and honored to attend this event and to celebrate the legacy of Jean Blondel. He was a seminal figure in the study of comparative politics and political institutions, and his work on political parties, systems of government, and interactions between parties, institutions, and behavior have shaped the learning and research of generations of political scientists and is part of the CPR. So we are proud to co-sponsor this event with the University of Essex. I would like to thank Jean Blondel, Professor Faten Goshen, and Professor Jean Martin, member of the ACPR Executive Committee, for organizing and making this possible. I'm also grateful to Professor Laura Morales. Thank you very much. She's the winner of 2005 Jean Blondel PhD Prize. Thank you for coming and sharing insightful reflections on this very important topic that you can see on the screen. So the polarization of immigration in Europe reflects deep societal, political, and cultural divides, and has obvious implications for democracy, influencing political behavior and policy making. So we really look forward to an inspiring talk in the name of Jean Blondel. Thank you.
All right, so I want to start off by thanking you all for coming. I'm Professor Faten Goshen. I'm head of the Department of Government. I know we have around 50 people online, so we can't see them, especially, and the weather doesn't really help. The people are coming from all around Europe, so that's really exciting as well. And so I also am delighted that we are co-sponsoring this event with the European Consortium for Political Research. And I'm going to leave it up to my colleague, Professor Shane Martin, to introduce our event and our speaker, Professor Laura Morales. But before I want to say a few words about the late and legendary Professor Jean Blondel of the Department of Government. For many of us within the Department of Government at the University of Essex, Jean was one of our founding heads who worked here between 1964 and 1984. And during this time, he not only helped establish our reputation as one of UK's leading universities for political science, he also defined our distinguishing approach that still exists till today. And so today, the Department of Government is still one of the top political science departments in the UK and home to the only Regius Professorship in Political Science in the UK, which is held by our colleague, Professor Christian Gleditsch. Now, introducing my colleague, Professor Shane Martin, who's also a distinguished scholar and leader in political science, currently holding the Anthony King Chair, another giant here in the Department of Government at the University of Essex, and he currently also serves as the Dean of Postgraduate Research and Education. As the former head of the Department of Government, Professor Martin has also played a pivotal role in enhancing our teaching, research, and governance at this university. His research focuses on legislative organization, exploring how electoral incentives shape behavior and institution, and he has held prestigious fellowships, including one from the British Academy. With extensive teaching experience across institutions worldwide, he continues to contribute to the field as a member of the Executive Committee of the European Consortium for Political Research. But before I turn over to Shane, I also want to thank our colleague, Dr. Jean Blondel, and our colleagues from ECPO staff who all made this happen. So thank you so much. And Professor Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Faten and Daniela, for your kind words, your support for the annual lecture, and for co-hosting this evening's event. In Ireland, my home country, a metric for how important a dinner is how many different types of potatoes you have. In the United Kingdom, a metric for how important a speaker is how many people get to introduce Laura. So this is a really important metric, and I will be equally brief. It's a particular pleasure to welcome this evening's distinguished speaker, Professor Laura Morales. Professor Morales was the 2005 winner of the Jean Blondel PhD Prize and has gone on to forge a distinguished career as one of your leading political scientists. Today, Laura is recognized for her exceptional scholarship on topics including political representation, comparative politics, political behavior, public opinion, political parties, political dynamics around migration and diversity, and social science research methods. Laura is research professor at the Spanish National Research Council in Madrid and full professor of political science and comparative politics at Sciences Po in Paris, as seen from Sciences Po, Paris. Earlier appointments include at the University of Leicester, where we were colleagues together, and a wonderful colleague you were, the University of Manchester, Mauritia, UCM, UAM, as well as numerous visiting appointments, including at Harvard, at Columbia, and the University of Amsterdam. Laura co-led the standing group on participation and mobilization of the ECPR between 2015 and 2017. And Laura also has extensive experience in the coordination of projects funded through international programs, including the EU framework programs, multinational research programs, European Research Council, etc. And the real capacity to translate political science research to a general audience is something that I've always appreciated in Laura. Tonight's lecture, as was mentioned by Daniela, is titled The Polarization of Immigration in Europe. What does it mean for democracy? And after Laura gives her presentation and lecture, there will be an opportunity for Q&As, both for colleagues who are joining us online and in the room. So a very warm welcome, Laura.
So thank you very much for those very kind words. I don't think they are fully deserved, but I will take them anyway. And I want to start by thanking both the Department of Government of the University of Essex and the ECPR for inviting me to give this Blondel lecture today. It's really an honor to have been invited to do so. And it's a real pleasure to be able to be here, given how important the ECPR has been throughout decades for my career. And today I will be presenting a kind of very general audience sort of lecture just to open up the debate and the discussion around what all of you, I'm sure, will agree is continuously a very topical matter, which is the polarization of immigration. And I will be sort of showing some very early results from a collaborative project, a Horizon Europe project called ACT-EU, which is focusing on understanding the implications and the consequences of polarization in general terms, political polarization in general terms, but then particularly on three policy domains: climate change, equality between men and women, and immigration. And on that kind of wider collaboration with lots of partners across Europe, I will not claim that this is work that I'm doing on my own, but actually a very large team of researchers all across Europe. We're sort of trying to dive in detail at what can we learn from the different sort of existing data sets around, in particular, the consequences of immigration and its polarization. So as you well know, and this is no news for you, immigration, but also diversity and integration of both migrants and the descendants of migrants is something that it's constantly on the news. It is very often on the news. It is politicized by political parties, sometimes on a daily basis. The news are covering, on the one hand, events that relate to incidents and flows, but they're equally covering events relating to anti-racist mobilization, as well as covering racist events. So the whole panoply of elements. And this is not just the UK, as I was just illustrating with a number of front pages from British newspapers, but it's the same all across Europe. And here are just some illustrations for France, for Belgium, for Spain, several on the same week, for Italy, and you could go on and on and on. The pervasiveness of the politicization and the media coverage of immigration has become almost like a daily event for all of us across Europe. And in addition to that, immigration is credited, or at least thought to be quite relevant in determining, or at the very least strongly shaping electoral outcomes. And kind of more recently, we know that the US presidential elections have been driven, to a certain extent at least, by debates around immigration. There's been explicit attempts to politicize, for example, refugee waves, and in particular refugee waves, with what many would describe as fake news. And actually, exit polls from the US presidential elections seem to suggest that sort of caring and being concerned about immigration is a very powerful predictor for voting for Donald Trump, in a way that other issues are not necessarily to exactly the same extent strong predictors on the other end, on the end of support. But it's not just the US elections. The recent Irish election, this is an honor of my colleague Shane, but also because the elections have just happened, the issue of immigration was also sort of quite highly debated, and how much the positions, for example, of Sinn Féin on immigration could actually harm the electoral prospects that were kind of previously considered relatively good and optimistic, and how the issue of immigration being tackled by at least a kind of progressive or left-wing party could be a soft spot for electoral results. And obviously in France, where I've been working for the last 7 years, immigration is a core aspect that has been driving politics for a very long time. And Jean Blondel has done very good research on that specifically. And immigration is one of the top issues that has driven systematically the increase in the vote for Rassemblement National, but also it's a driver of both the anti-immigrant sentiment and kind of support for the parties that are going to try to stop Rassemblement National from winning office. So it's a powerful motivator, both the discussion around how to manage immigration, but also the debate around the consequences for integration, for inclusion, for equality of rights of migrants and the descendants and ethnic minorities. It's a sort of wide-ranging set of issues. And obviously, we have the kind of recently announced German elections ahead, and it's very much on the spotlight whether immigration will again become a determining factor. So if we consider all of that, and we also have the demographic perspective in mind, it is actually true that in recent years, migration flows to Europe have been increasing. Part of it is relating to refugee waves that have been coming to Europe from different corners of the world, but a lot of it actually from OECD statistics show that it's also relating to family reunification flows because of historical flows and the gap, the time gap that actually happens between sort of economic migration and then the adjustment in terms of family reunion movements. So this is really a phenomenon that it's not going to go away. If we think about how the world is becoming increasingly contentious in terms of international conflict, but also how climate change is going to affect population movements, this is going to be an issue that it's going to stay with us. And currently the debate is such that it's not propitious, if we can put it that way, for an understanding and a calm debate about it. And so in this context, we already know that immigration has potentially kind of powerful consequences for electoral outcomes, or at the very least for electoral competition. What we're trying to understand a little bit better in this project is what are the consequences for other aspects that relate to democratic politics? What are the consequences that immigration has, and very importantly, the polarization around immigration and how the issue of immigration is handled? What are the consequences that it can have for democratic attitudes more generally, but also importantly for other forms of political participation and political behavior other than elections. So we're going to be focusing on topics, and I will be presenting just some kind of samples of our research lines on that in regards to what are the consequences for political trust, what are the consequences for other types of democratic outcomes, and also importantly for feelings of representation and of being heard, listened to when claims are made. So as most of you will know, attitudes towards immigration and the diversity that immigration brings are multidimensional, and the scholarship, I will not be giving a long talk about the various aspects of the literature, but I think it's important to, at the very least, emphasize that there are two sort of broadly speaking dimensions that are relevant when we try to understand how attitudes towards immigration, diversity, and immigrants pan out in the citizenry. One is the perceptions and the sentiments that citizens develop around the economic dimension, so the economic or material benefit or threat that immigration brings, and how they position themselves around that dimension. And the second one is how citizens perceive and how they develop feelings and emotions and different sorts of evaluation around how much immigration and the diversity that it brings can be a threat to traditions, to ways of doing things, to culture, to feelings of nationhood and who we are. And so people may oppose or support immigration because they think that it's good or it's bad for the economy, but also they might actually oppose or support immigration because of the sort of cultural diversity that it brings. And it's important to bear in mind both dimensions. Sometimes people will sort of hold consistent opinions and evaluations and sentiments around both aspects, but sometimes they don't. And then we should not, I think that there's kind of a big elephant in the room, we should not forget that additionally some people are racist and have prejudice against people that are perceived as from different races or ethnicities. So these are kind of three important elements to bear in mind. So starting from the existing literature and the very consolidated body of evidence that shows that there are this sort of kind of three, broadly speaking, elements or dimensions to how people think about migration. What we've been doing in the project, and we've been running the project for like a year and a half right now, we're bringing together all of the data that exists in cross-national surveys around attitudes to immigration or around immigration and diversity. So we've been kind of plunging ourselves into the European Social Survey, the European Value Studies, ISSP, the Eurobarometers, the European Election Studies, and the Transatlantic Trends Survey. And sort of examining all of the survey items that are available and presented these surveys and that cover European countries, and kind of selected a range of items that are present in most countries and in most years. And looking at the dimensionality of it, selecting those that are better capturing, precisely because you don't really have a good time series that are kind of cross-nationally available for the 2 decades that we're interested in. And we have selected in a kind of funnel approach 3 indicators, which are the ones that I'm going to be focusing from now on. And I just wanted to justify how we made this choice. It was a kind of methodologically carefully considered from this wide range of indicators. We did principal component analysis to look at the dimensionality. This is a complex exercise because they're not present in all of the surveys or across all of the countries, and you need to actually do this in iterative manners, both at the European level, so aggregating all of the countries, and then country by country to check whether the patterns are kind of more or less replicated across the board. And then we've selected these 3 survey items that actually capture quite well and for the good and for the bad, the 3 items actually that best represent the dimensions that come up in our analysis are from the European Social Survey, which has, first of all, kudos to the European Social Survey for doing their work so well, but also it has the advantage that then allows you to analyze with the European Social Survey the whole set of dimensions. And these are the 3 items, one looking at whether the individual evaluates that immigration is good or bad for the economy on a 0 to 10 scale, and another one where the individual assesses or gives their view in terms of whether the immigrants make the country worse or a worse or better place to live in. So one is focusing on the contribution of immigrants to the economy. The other one is focusing on the cultural benefits or otherwise of diversity. And the third one actually captures quite well this aspect of racial or ethnic prejudice that I was mentioning before, whether the race or ethnicity of migrants would actually be a factor that is important. And I will be presenting now a series of analysis around how that has evolved over time, but also importantly across different countries. And one of the things that stands out, and I will hopefully not get you too dizzy with too many graphs, which is a risk with some of this cross-national analysis, especially when you introduce all of these layers of complexity. You want to sort of look at the complexity of attitudes towards immigration, at least these 3 different components that are worth assessing, but there's also the overtime perspective and the consumption perspective, and at a certain point, this can become all a little bit too much in terms of the information. But one of the first things that I wanted to sort of outline and present to you is that how these 3 dimensions are behaving is, first of all, not the same over time, but very importantly, not the same across European countries. When we focus on, and this is done only with the 15 countries for which the European Social Survey has data for all 11 waves, including the recent wave that has been made publicly available just a few weeks ago. What we actually find is that the positions and the attitudes or orientations, whichever way you want to call it, that relate to the cultural dimension are a lot more stable than the ones relating to the economy, but also that the polarization does change depending on which of these facets you're looking at very importantly, the cross-national variation in that polarization also changes massively when you're looking at these 3 different dimensions. Now, in this figure, it's a little bit difficult to see exactly what's going on because there are 15 countries and these 3 dimensions over time. As I was saying, I don't know if I can actually take the microphone with me. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight for those of you who are here in the room is, first of all, that we see in most countries a lot more stability in relation to the indicator of sort of cultural consequences of immigrants making the country a worse or better place to live. Whereas in many countries, we do see that both the heterogeneity and hence the polarization, but also the fluctuation of the indicator relating to the economy is a lot more variable. But importantly, while we see kind of more similarities, of course, every country has different patterns, and it would take me too long to actually go through all of them for the 15 countries, and I want to show you other stuff as well. What is really important is to see that there's kind of huge differences in, for example, how that has evolved and what are the situations in relation to racist and ethnic prejudice. And we do see huge differences across Europe. For example, if we compare the situation for Sweden and the situation for Hungary, but also the evolution of, unfortunately, the ECPR square is there in the middle of Spain, preventing you to see the shift of polarization in that sense towards the positive end of reacting. And it's no surprise, for example, if we focus on the Spanish case just for 1 second, it's connected to the rise of the radical right party Vox. And so these attitudes are actually differently malleable depending on the circumstances, depending on the politicization of immigration that happens on the ground. Some of them are more sensitive, others are less, are kind of more stable over time. And it's very important to understand that as a background of what do we talk about when we talk about the polarization of immigration. The polarization is not the same when we're focusing on the economic dimension that when we're focusing on the cultural dimension. And even if you focus on the cultural dimension, it's not the same when we're thinking about nationhood in a generic sense, or about how citizens might want to protect traditional ways of doing in their countries, or when we focus on racist and ethnic prejudice. So other aspects that we're doing beyond mapping that complexity of the picture of what polarization around immigration actually means is to also try to understand who are the people who are, what sort of sectors of the population are more sensitive to that polarization. And I will not be bringing all of the graphs that could potentially be produced in relation to this, but I wanted to focus on a number of important demographic factors, variables that we typically take into consideration. And the first one is gender. We see considerable differences on how relevant gender is and how consequential gender is in terms of being polarized around immigration, depending on which of these dimensions we're actually looking at. So if you're focusing on the economic dimension, we see that by and large, there's differences, and each country, again, has a slightly different outlook, which is also important to emphasize. But kind of by and large, meant to be the polarizers in a sense, or at least those who have a kind of a wider spectrum of views on the economy and the economic impact of immigration as opposed to women. But that's actually not the case when you move and focus to the kind of generic cultural dimension, where the gaps between men and women are kind of relatively minor and only in a few countries. And it changes yet again if you focus on racial and ethnic prejudice. Within this case, in some countries, not in all, so I won't generalize on this point, women being the ones that actually are more polarized, they have a kind of wider diversity of positions on that regard around immigration. Now, if we sort of repeat this, and I will do it with fewer figures as we move along, that actually is also the case with education, where we find considerable gaps when we're looking at evaluations of the benefits or the threats that immigration pose for the economy, with individuals with tertiary education being more homogeneous in their views, and citizens with non-tertiary education being more polarized, being more heterogeneous in the views that they share. Instead, this idea that immigration actually is kind of increasingly being polarized by the rural-urban divide is not necessarily the case in most of the countries we see. Obviously, there will be different average positions on immigration between urban dwellers and rural dwellers, but in terms of who and kind of which part of the demographics are driving polarization internally, we don't see this pattern going up. So the next thing that we're doing in the project is understanding beyond electoral behavior, how this polarization around immigration map into other outcomes that we're interested in, for example, political trust, but also, as I will be showing in a minute. The first thing that we see is that there's kind of tends to be a sort of systematic curvilinear relation across most of the countries in terms of political trust on kind of both ends of the spectrum of the positions. And I've chosen only some of the indicators. This is the distance from the median on immigration, and the index of trust, an average index of trust in political actors and institutions. And you can see that across most of the countries, you do see this kind of slightly curvilinear relationship. And you do find kind of systematically that pattern when you look at satisfaction with democracy as well, and with most other indicators. So people who are at both ends of the polarization spectrum are the ones kind of feeling, even if they might be pro-immigrant, but it's sort of being at the stream actually reduces or seems to be related to lower levels of political trust, but also lower levels of satisfaction with democracy. And instead, we find the opposite kind of relation when it comes to protest behavior. So we're seeing here a set of kind of recurrent patterns of citizens who are at the extremes, whether that's pro-immigration or anti-immigration, manifesting across a wide range of European countries, this kind of syndrome of political alienation and resorting to protest as part probably of that whole syndrome of being unhappy about how the debate around immigration is going from both sides, in a sense. The final thing that I wanted to show you, just as a kind of as a debate opener, are some very fresh results from a survey that we conducted in the context of this project, the ACT-EU project, the Horizon Europe project, in the spring of 2024. And we've only now kind of been able to start analyzing the data from the survey. This is a survey that was commissioned and funded through the project in 10 countries, 10 EU, European member state countries: Austria, Czechia, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Poland, and Spain. And in all of these countries, an online survey was conducted through the Ipsos panel of approximately 20 minutes. with 1,300 respondents per country. So we have a total of 13,000 respondents, and obviously the survey covers a range of topics, but I will be focusing today on just providing you with a very small snapshot of a vignette experiment that we embedded in the survey that I think it's actually quite relevant to the point I was making before. So in this vignette experiment, we present respondents, as you usually do in vignette survey experiments, a hypothetical situation. So we ask respondents to think about a situation where political decision makers need to make controversial decisions. This is sort of the nature of everyday politics, and obviously whenever they're making decisions, in most cases, some sectors of society agree with that policy and others disagree. So they need to put themselves in a situation where Parliament is considering a new measure concerning a specific policy, and what we randomly vary is what the policy is about. 1/3 of the respondents see that the policy is about climate change, another third see that the policy is about equality between men and women, and another third get that it's about the management of immigration. And we ask them to sort of put themselves in the hypothetical situation that they disagree with whatever the choice is. We thought very carefully about whether to say what the decision was, but because actually the debate on immigration is really discussing very different things in these 10 countries, we were not able to find a single specific decision that would be equally or similarly topical and current in all 10 countries. That's kind of one of the complications of comparative research. So we put it sort of quite broad and just ask them to put themselves in the shoes of someone who disagrees with the decision. And then we ask them to imagine that in reaction to that decision, different types of actors, so 1/3 randomly shown for each individual, either a group of ordinary citizens or the opposition or a celebrity, is organizing a form of protest against that decision. And we wanted to vary as well both the level of contentiousness, but also the cost, how costly the form of political action and engagement actually was. And we're very specific that this is to show dissatisfaction with the decision and the proposal. And then we ask individuals to indicate how likely it is that they would join that action from a 0 to 100 scale, extremely unlikely to extremely likely, how acceptable they think that this action would be on the same sort of scale. And finally, the outcome of interest that I want to show you today is how likely do they think that decision makers would listen to the concerns raised by these activists. And so I just want to show to you, as I said, kind of fresh off the oven, what are the results when we are considering exclusively the shift in the policy topic. And so what we find is that when the policy is about immigration, and we keep all other factors constant, that will actually reduce, as compared to when the policy is on climate change or gender equality, the likelihood of feeling that the action, whichever of the 4 types of action, will be listened to by 1.6 points. And this is a significant difference. So considering that climate change is also highly polarized, and that these are 3 policy issues that were selected precisely because they are being increasingly polarized and politicized, we do see a significant gap in the expectations of being listened to if you resort to protest. Now, because we have the 10 countries, we can then assess, well, how common this effect really is. And it's important to highlight that this cross-national variability is not necessarily going in exactly the same direction across all of the countries. So for most of the countries, the effect is a negative effect on feelings of being heard and listened to. But in two countries, in Austria and Italy, the effect is prima facie reverse, but not significant. So by and large, what we sort of kind of tentatively find is that immigration is not just polarized, and it's actually having this kind of consequences for attitudes, but also that it has potentially the capacity to frustrate citizens even more than other issues that are also highly contentious and that are difficult in terms of where the conversation is going. So in conclusion, I wanted to just kind of open up the debate of today's lecture by emphasizing that immigration is an increasingly contested and polarized policy domain that is driving media attention almost on a daily basis, at the very least on a weekly basis. As of recently, political parties are increasingly wanting to compete during the electoral cycle around the issue of immigration. But it's a problem that it's going to be sticking around for very long. Both the political parties that are mobilizing around immigration to propose an anti-immigrant or kind of closed border sort of policy or kind of more restrictive policy are facing the constraint that they never really manage to put in place the policies that they are advocating successfully. This is fueling increasingly dissatisfaction and political alienation. And we're sort of seeing a generic pattern of sort of resorting to contentious mobilization, but also to lower expectations of responsiveness. So the point I wanted to make is that there's a lot of evidence suggesting that unless we have a kind of more recent debate around immigration that tries to lower a little bit the tone and try to sort of tackle the various complexities that countries will really have to face in the context of increasing international conflicts, the mobility of people who are fleeing war, but also that might be fleeing famine or might be fleeing just climate change. We might find ourselves in a situation where political parties don't have the capacity to respond to the expectations that they themselves are setting. That's fueling greater political alienation, greater contention that anyway is going to sort of harm their possibilities of getting re-elected in the first place, if that's what they were hoping to achieve. And at the end of the day, the consequences will be just negative overall for democracy without actually immigration having been solved as a problem that needs to actually be tackled in the areas where it does pose policy challenges. Thank you. And yeah.